Security pulled black woman off plane. Then she pulled $4 billion in funding from the airline. Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories. Emma Williams arrived at the airport just before dawn. The terminal still sleepy at 5:43 a.m. She didn't rush, standing slightly apart from the growing crowd. Her worn sneakers and simple hoodie contrasted with the sleek, polished passengers around her. As she approached the priority lane, a slim, well-dressed employee, John Miller, eyed her with a flicker of hesitation. He politely gestured toward the line reserved for first class, and Emma simply raised her phone, showing her boarding pass without a word. His smile faltered briefly, but he scanned her pass. "Go ahead," he muttered, almost as if he couldn't quite believe it. The air around her buzzed with unspoken judgment, but Emma moved forward, unfazed. She had learned long ago that distance often invited suspicion, but it never stopped her from taking her place. At security, the routine felt different today, though her boarding pass clearly indicated TSA pre-check clearance. Emma was pulled aside without explanation. The agent's hands moved with mechanical precision, rifling through her tote with no sense of urgency, but an unmistakable air of suspicion. Travel-sized toiletries, a book, a sealed envelope. He paused at the envelope, flipping it over as if searching for something hidden. "What's this? Legal documents?" he asked, his voice casual but laced with curiosity. Emma remained calm, her voice steady as she replied, "Private." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he waved her through with a shrug, as if the matter was too trivial to pursue further. Around her, the line moved smoothly for others, men in suits, families with designer luggage, a woman wearing a diamond necklace. Emma didn't react. She had long since grown used to the invisible walls built around her. Walls that made her feel like an outsider. Even when she belonged, she stood quietly, waiting, as the world around her hummed with routine ignorance. When Emma reached the security checkpoint, she had already steeled herself for the next round of scrutiny. The lines moved swiftly for others, but for her, everything was a little slower, a little more deliberate, as her boarding pass clearly indicated TSA pre-check clearance. She thought she would be gliding through without a hitch, but fate had other plans. The agent behind the counter, a tall man with dark, watchful eyes, gave her a sharp glance as she approached. Without a word, he motioned for her to step aside. "Random check," he muttered, his voice flat, as though he'd said it 100 times before. His eyes lingered just a second longer on her as if trying to detect something hidden beneath the surface. Emma didn't react, merely complying with the unspoken order. He gestured to a side table, where a second officer was already waiting with gloved hands and an expression that barely masked his boredom. Emma placed her tote bag on the table, aware of how every single item inside felt like it was being examined under a microscope. The agent rummaged through it methodically, her travel-sized toiletries, her book, the sealed envelope, and a single folder tied with a red string. When he paused over the folder, Emma's calm never wavered. He flipped it over and eyed her carefully. "What's this?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Legal documents," Emma replied without hesitation, her tone even, almost too calm. The agent eyed her for a beat, almost as if he was expecting her to crack under the weight of his silent interrogation. But Emma didn't flinch. She had been through this enough times to know that control was as much about maintaining composure as it was about any physical gesture. "You a lawyer or something?" he asked, the words tinged with curiosity but no real interest in the answer. "Not exactly," she replied, her voice soft, but it carried an authority that seemed to put him at ease. He shrugged after a moment, clearly uninterested in pursuing the matter further. "All right, go ahead," he said, waving her through. But as she picked up her bag and continued on, Emma couldn't help but notice the fleeting glances of the people behind her. The contrast was striking. Couples with matching luggage, a businessman with a Bluetooth headset, and an elderly woman in pearls. All were breezing through with barely a second glance from the staff. Emma, though, was held to a different standard, a pattern she had grown accustomed to. But she didn't react. She had long since stopped expecting the world to treat her like everyone else. Instead, she simply moved forward, her gaze steady and unbothered, as the world around her buzzed with a kind of quiet ignorance. The system had chosen her to be the one who was questioned, who was detained, who was scrutinized, but that didn't bother Emma. It never had. As she passed through the checkpoint and entered the waiting area, her thoughts were already elsewhere. She had learned long ago to navigate this world without looking for approval. Without waiting for someone to tell her she belonged. She knew her worth, and she wasn't about to let anyone, least of all a stranger in a uniform, make her feel otherwise. When Emma finally reached the gate, the atmosphere shifted once more. It wasn't just the buzz of passengers around her or the way the gate agents moved with practiced ease, it was the subtle, lingering sensation of being out of place. She could feel it again, the invisible walls that separated her from the rest of the crowd. The first-class passengers, in their tailored suits and polished shoes, moved with an air of confidence that was almost palpable. Emma, on the other hand, had learned long ago to move quietly through spaces where she wasn't always expected. She wasn't the person people looked at twice. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here to observe, to test, to confirm something she had suspected for years. She took a seat in the far corner of the waiting area, far from the gleaming glass walls and the cluster of executives gathered near the boarding door. There, in the relative silence, she rested her tote bag on her lap and pulled out the sealed envelope. It was heavy, not physically, but metaphorically. Inside was the culmination of years of work, a financial transfer that had the power to alter the future of one of the largest airline mergers in North America. She wasn't just a passenger. And this wasn't just a flight. She was the decision-maker, the final signature that would either approve or dismantle the merger. As she sat there, her fingers brushed the edges of the envelope, and she couldn't help but notice the way the people around her reacted. A child in a stroller nearby stared at her, wide-eyed, no doubt curious about the calm, composed woman sitting alone in the corner. Emma offered a small, polite smile, but the child's mother quickly turned the stroller away, as if she had been caught staring at something she shouldn't have. It didn't matter. Emma didn't mind the quiet rejection. She had learned to be invisible when she needed to be. But what she wasn't invisible to, however, was the system around her. She had become well acquainted with the way people like her were treated, ignored, excluded, never quite fitting in. She wasn't the kind of person anyone expected to wield real power. And that, she realized, was exactly why she was the one who needed to be watching. She wasn't here to enjoy the luxuries of first class or to take advantage of the perks of her seat. She was here to test something, to see how they would treat her when they thought she was just another regular passenger. The final boarding call echoed through the loudspeakers, pulling Emma from her thoughts. She watched as the gate agent greeted passengers with practiced politeness, ushering them onto the plane without hesitation. When it was her turn, the agent barely glanced at her. First class and executive platinum only, he said, his voice almost too flat to be polite. Emma remained calm, showing her boarding pass again. 2A, she said, her voice steady but quiet. The agent blinked, scanned her pass, and forced a tight smile. Go ahead, he muttered, clearly still uncertain about her place among the privileged passengers. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, Emma could feel the eyes of those around her following her every move. They were watching, but not with curiosity or even surprise. It was more like confirmation that she didn't belong here. And yet, she did. She didn't need to shout, to assert herself, to prove anything. She simply needed to be. She walked slowly, deliberately, down the jet bridge, her tote bag slung over her shoulder and the envelope still resting gently in her lap. She was the one in control. Not them. They just didn't know it yet. As Emma settled into her seat in the front of the plane, she could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The plane was alive with the hum of passengers getting comfortable. But there was a tension in the air, an unspoken judgment that hung around her like an invisible fog. She wasn't the kind of person people expected to see in seat 2A. And she was well aware of the glances that followed her every move. The man beside her, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray sports coat and designer glasses, offered a polite nod, but quickly turned his attention to his tablet, seemingly eager to return to his email. Emma didn't mind. She wasn't here to make friends or seek approval. The cabin attendants moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, their eyes skimming over her without really seeing her. She wasn't part of the fabric of this space. Not in the way the others were. She wasn't the type to ask for special treatment. But she knew, without a doubt, that the treatment she would receive would be very different from the others, subtle, almost imperceptible, but clear nonetheless. She watched as one of the attendants, a woman with sleek dark hair pulled into a neat bun, handed out bottles of water to passengers in row 1, then row 3, but when she reached Emma's row, she passed by without so much as a glance, continuing down the aisle as though Emma didn't exist. Emma didn't react. She had been through this dance before. It wasn't about the water, it was about the power dynamic. She was invisible because they needed her to be. Their treatment of her was deliberate, calculated, designed to remind her of her place in the invisible hierarchy of the plane. But Emma wasn't going to let it bother her. Not yet. She simply sat there, the weight of the envelope still resting in her lap, feeling the subtle sting of being purposefully overlooked. The food cart rolled down the aisle next, and Emma's stomach clenched slightly. She wasn't hungry, but the way the flight attendants served the others, offering warm bread rolls, plates of hot meals, and polite smiles, made her hyper-aware of the gap between her and everyone else. As the attendant reached her row, she glanced at Emma's seat, then quickly turned her attention to the man beside her. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" the attendant asked, her tone warm and attentive, as though she had already decided Emma wasn't worth the effort. Emma kept her gaze steady on the window, her fingers brushing lightly against the envelope. She could feel the way the world around her was shifting, but she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The man beside her shot her a confused look, but she didn't acknowledge it. He, like everyone else, had no idea who she was or why she was here. He assumed she was just another passenger, sitting quietly, invisible among the crowd, and that was exactly what she needed them to think. But as the flight continued, Emma couldn't help but feel the growing tension in the cabin. It was subtle at first, the way the staff moved around her, careful not to make eye contact, avoiding direct service, as if she didn't deserve the same level of attention as everyone else. She could feel the undercurrent of discomfort, the way she was being quietly excluded from the privileges that came with her seat. From the simple courtesy extended to every other first-class passenger, Emma knew what was happening, and she didn't need to fight back or make a scene. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand to be seen. She just needed to stay quiet, stay calm, and wait for the moment when everything would change. Because the truth was, she wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just here to take a flight. She was here for something far bigger. And when the time came, everyone around her would understand the weight of her presence. But for now, she stayed still, watching the world around her unfold with an almost detached sense of clarity. She was aware of every glance, every subtle snub, and it was all building toward something they couldn't yet see, but that she knew was coming. And when it arrived, it would be quiet, just like her. It would be the kind of power that didn't need to scream to be heard. As the flight continued its steady ascent, Emma remained perfectly still, her eyes trained on the view outside the window. But her mind was far from the clouds. She had been here before, in these quiet, unnoticed moments, where everything felt deliberate, every look, every word, every act of exclusion designed to keep her in her place. She could feel the subtle tension building around her, small gestures, tiny slights, carefully orchestrated to remind her she didn't belong. But Emma wasn't someone who shrank away from discomfort. She wasn't here to be made comfortable. She was here to test something, to expose something that had long been buried beneath the polished surface of this world. Her thoughts were interrupted when the cabin crew began to make their rounds, distributing snacks and drinks. She noticed the man next to her, the one in the tailored gray sports coat, getting his drink first, an iced coffee. No hesitation. The attendant smiled at him, exchanging a brief conversation about the weather and the flight ahead. Then she moved down the aisle, offering drinks to the passengers in rows 1 and 3. When she reached Emma's row, however, something shifted. The attendant paused, looked down at her manifest, and then glanced back at Emma with the kind of practiced neutrality that could be mistaken for politeness. But Emma knew better. The smile didn't reach the attendant's eyes. And without a word, she moved on, skipping her entirely. Emma remained calm, her fingers tracing the edges of the envelope resting in her lap. She had expected this. She had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words. And right now, her stillness was saying everything. It wasn't about the drink. It wasn't about the meal that she was no longer offered. It was about the power dynamics that played out so seamlessly, so invisibly, that most people didn't even notice. But Emma noticed. She saw the way the staff moved around her, carefully avoiding direct service, as if she were somehow less deserving than everyone else. When the food cart came through, Emma was barely aware of the selection. It didn't matter to her. Not really. What mattered was the way the staff had already made their decision about her place in the hierarchy of the flight. As the attendant rolled the cart past her, her gaze briefly flicked to Emma, and Emma saw it, just for a second. A flash of something, before the attendant turned away and offered the man next to her a polite, practiced smile, asking him what he would like to eat. Emma didn't react. She had learned to exist in the background, to let the moments pass like shadows, unnoticed by the very system that had decided she didn't belong. But she wasn't fooled. She knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't the overt slights, the open acts of rudeness that would be easiest to fight against. It was the quiet exclusion, the small gestures that piled up, one on top of another, designed to make her feel small, invisible, unworthy of the same attention as everyone else. And that, Emma realized, was the point. The power wasn't in making noise, in demanding attention. The real power was in remaining silent, in letting the system reveal itself. It wasn't enough for her to speak up, it wasn't enough for her to fight back with words. The system had to expose itself, to show how deeply ingrained its biases were, how effortlessly it worked to marginalize people like her. She remained in her seat, her fingers gently brushing the envelope, her gaze fixed on the window as the flight continued to the rhythm of the cabin crew's movements. Everything was unfolding according to plan. Emma wasn't here to disrupt the flight, she wasn't here to fight with anyone. She was here to observe, to let the silence settle and see who would blink first. The silence spoke volumes, and she was ready to let it all play out. By the time the flight attendants made their rounds again, the mood in the cabin had shifted. The tension was almost palpable, though no one spoke of it directly. Emma felt the subtle weight of their watchful eyes, staff moving around her with calculated indifference. Passengers who had long since settled into the unspoken routine of air travel, each one oblivious to the quiet storm brewing just below the surface. Emma remained perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the envelope in her lap, her gaze outward but focused inward. She wasn't here to make a scene, she wasn't here to shout or demand attention. But she knew the system had already taken notice of her. They just didn't know what they were dealing with yet. The moment came with the arrival of the cabin supervisor. James Bryce, tall and composed, walked down the aisle, his clipboard in hand, his eyes scanning the rows. When he reached Emma's, he paused just long enough for her to feel the weight of his presence. There was something in the air now, something that told her this wasn't a routine check. Bryce's gaze flickered to her boarding pass, still visible on the seat pocket in front of her, and lingered there for a moment too long, as though trying to read something that wasn't there. He glanced at her, then back at the boarding pass, and with a slight frown, he straightened up. His tone was polite but guarded. "We've had a seating issue," he said, his words clipped. "Would you mind if I rescanned your credentials?" Emma didn't react, didn't flinch. She simply lifted her phone from the armrest and unlocked it, offering him the screen with a practiced calm. She had been here before, an unspoken challenge, a quiet test of power that she had no intention of failing. Bryce scanned the boarding pass, his eyes narrowing slightly as the screen refreshed with the same details it had shown hours ago. The silence stretched between them, long enough to feel uncomfortable. But Emma didn't break it. She didn't need to. She wasn't the one on trial here. "That's strange," Bryce muttered after a long moment, as if the issue were beyond his comprehension. "It must have been a system glitch," he added, his voice lacking any real conviction. Emma simply nodded, offering no further response. Bryce didn't apologize, didn't explain further. He simply made a note on his clipboard, his expression still unreadable. And then, with a strange finality, he walked away, his footsteps echoing down the aisle as he disappeared into the cockpit. Emma stayed in her seat, unfazed, but as the minutes ticked by, she could feel the shift. It was subtle at first, quiet murmurs from passengers around her. The sudden change in the way the flight attendants interacted with her. Now distant, now cold, as if they were no longer sure how to handle her presence. She had become a question in their carefully constructed world, a question they couldn't quite answer. The sense of exclusion intensified, as the cabin continued to fill with the usual hum of in-flight service. Emma was left to observe. Olivia Carter, the lead flight attendant, passed by her seat again, offering drinks and snacks to everyone else. But when she reached Emma's row, she passed her without a word, without a glance. The drink cart moved on. A blur of efficiency for everyone except Emma. The people around her didn't notice. Or if they did, they pretended not to. But Emma noticed. Every action, every detail, was part of the slow, deliberate build-up, a strategy designed to reinforce the invisible barrier between her and the rest of the world. She didn't speak up. She didn't demand an explanation. She let the silence speak for her. It was enough for them to know she wasn't like the others. She didn't need to fit in. She didn't need to be coddled or treated with special care. What mattered was that they knew, deep down, that they had underestimated her. And that was the most powerful statement she could make. Emma was the one who controlled the narrative now. And they didn't even realize it yet. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin became impossible to ignore. The staff's indifference toward Emma grew more pronounced with every passing minute. The attendants handed out food and drinks, skipping over her row, deliberately avoiding eye contact. She was being erased, not with obvious acts of cruelty, but with subtle dismissals, skipped offers, ignored requests. The meal cart rolled by, and Emma watched as her row went unnoticed again, the attendant making a point to serve everyone else first. She didn't flinch. Her calm was her weapon. But Emma wasn't here for petty service. She wasn't here to be coddled. Her purpose was far bigger. She had learned long ago that true power wasn't in making noise, it was in remaining unshaken. In letting the system expose itself. The small slights were stacking up. And she knew that when the time came, it would be these very moments that would reveal the truth. She sat still, the envelope resting heavily in her lap. Every passing minute building toward something greater. The game was unfolding. Emma was just waiting for the right moment to show them who was truly in control. As the plane began its descent, Emma remained unmoved, her fingers gently resting on the envelope in her lap. The subtle shifts in the cabin, the quiet whispers exchanged among the crew, only confirmed what she had known all along. They were watching her now, no longer with the casual dismissal of before, but with the uneasy recognition that she was someone far more significant than they had assumed. When the cabin manager, Bryce, stopped by to check her seat assignment, it was a quiet confirmation of their unease. The system had failed to recognize her, and now they were scrambling to correct their mistake. Emma didn't respond, didn't rise to their provocations. She simply sat, calm, unbothered, as the flight attendants moved around her, avoiding direct contact. She knew that this was the moment. The small, calculated shifts of power were coming to a head. The silence she had maintained was louder than any confrontation could ever be. When the time came, she would show them exactly who was in control, and they would realize, far too late, that it was never them. As the plane touched down, Emma's hand instinctively moved to the envelope, the final piece in her quiet game of power. The moment the seatbelt sign clicked off, she stood, her movements measured and deliberate. She walked calmly down the aisle, her totes slung over her shoulder. As two security officers awaited her by the door, their presence, though professional, felt like a formality. They had been instructed to follow her, to scrutinize her every step. But Emma knew this was just another attempt to control the narrative. She didn't resist. As they led her through the terminal, she felt no fear, only the weight of everything they had tried to ignore. When they finally arrived at a small, sterile room, she placed the envelope on the desk without a word. "This," she said quietly, "is why you're here." Her calm authority filled the room. And in that moment, they understood, the system they thought they controlled was now in her hands. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength doesn't always come from loud resistance, but from quiet, unshakable confidence. Emma's journey shows us that sometimes, the best way to expose injustice is through calm observation and the subtle assertion of control. In a world that often judges us based on appearance or assumptions, never forget that you have the power to change the narrative, silently but firmly. If this story made you think, reflect, or inspire you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing stories that challenge the norms and reveal the hidden truths of the world. Join us on this journey. Subscribe now and never miss a moment of powerful storytelling.